So we're going to talk a little bit, like Jared said, about carbon credits and ag, and kind of talk about some of the hits or misses. And there's going to be a lot of misses in these contracts currently. I guess that's the best way to put it. I'm also a part of this, the Ag Law Education Initiative. I'm at the University of Maryland, but I'm a part of this program. You can get some information at umaglaw.org. We are trying, like Jared said, to do a lot with University of Delaware and help build out some of the resources there as well for UD. Skip that. None of this is legal advice. I'm glad we're all good with it. I'm going to keep going. So what we're going to talk about today with this is kind of, we have to talk about the Growing Climate Solutions Act, which is currently before the U.S. House, and how it will impact carbon markets or potentially impact carbon markets. And then what should you be thinking about with contracts that could come up in this space? The thing I need to point out, and this is something myself and a few other legal people at other land grants have struggled with over the past year or so, since this kind of came back up as something where producers and landowners needed to start thinking about it, is there aren't that many contracts that people can easily turn over to us. And when we do find them, sometimes they're not always the best contracts, and we can talk a little bit about that later. But I did want to share this initially, just so folks could start thinking about it. And this was from 2010, and I found this on Farm Doc Daily through the University of Illinois, looking at some of the break-even prices, at least in 2010, for sequestering of carbon. So metric ton of CO2 equivalent, and how much that would cost. So looking at, if we switch from conventional tillage to no-till, we're in about the $30 range. If we retire cultivated organic soils to permanent grasslands, it gets a little cheaper to make that break even. And then we're restoring forested wetlands, still high. And we're seeing the biggest impact from these grasslands. As we kind of talk about this moving forward, I want you to keep this in mind as we look at what some of the prices being offered are potentially, and what some of the other stuff that could potentially come up. So the first thing you need to keep in mind is this is very much still a very evolving market. Most of the markets are voluntary. They're not mandatory. California is the only state with currently mandatory carbon markets. Everywhere else, there's some voluntary ones in this region. The vast majority of these are voluntary transactions that are taking place here in the US. So kind of start with the Growing Climate Change Solutions Act. This is a bipartisan bill. It passed the Senate back in April of last year, 92-8. It's now before the House Ag Committee. I'm going to highlight a video at the end so you can kind of listen as to what folks from the House Ag Committee are thinking about this bill. This would ensure that basically ag has a seat at the table for any potential voluntary climate markets. There's no mandatory climate markets initiated in this. It's all voluntary. The biggest things it's going to end up doing is it would set up these greenhouse gas technical assistance providers, and this would set up a certification process for these. So anyone providing technical expertise, information, and tools to producers in this area could go through this voluntary certification process. There'd also be a voluntary certification process for third-party verification programs. And these basically, as we're going to talk about when we get the contract, sort of set the standards for how these markets operate. None of this would be required. You could go out and work with anybody they wanted to, but you could still go with these voluntary certified people. And this would basically ensure that we can at least look at what's going on in the market and relate it back to something to where we have some set standards for what should be going on. The other thing it's going to do is once it goes into effect, USDA would have to work with EPA to assess all of these existing voluntary carbon markets and verification programs that are out there. And then they would have to do that every 4 years, just to help us better understand where the markets are at and how they're evolving and how these verification programs are evolving, so folks better have ideas as to what should be going on in this space. And that's kind of what we're at with that law. So let's talk about what most people want to hear about, which is the carbon contracts. So as we look at this, there are two approaches you can take with these contracts. The first is working through what is known as an aggregator. And this is where the producer or the landowner is going to sell the entire control of the project over to an aggregator. The aggregator is going to make decisions involving whatever carbon contract credits are going to go on that piece of property. So they're going to look at when to sell, and they'll also look at what data to share. As we look at these a lot, we have to take into account there's going to be a lot of data sharing going on. So either through data being assessed through, the farm equipment with nutrients going down, anything involving the farm where data is being collected so we can see the practices that are taking place, that's going to be potentially shared in this scenario with a third party to be able to verify and take into account how much carbon is actually being sequestered. The other approach we can take is through this data manager approach. And this is where, the producer or the landowner is going to hire a data manager. And all they're going to do is work with the person to enter the market for either a fee or some sort of revenue sharing in the end. So they're much more just helping facilitate a transaction that could take place if the producer actually wants to make, sell credits. Under the data manager approach, if you go through it, you really haven't sold an interest in carbon credits. Yeah, you get to make that decision when to do it. So either one of these can work, and how they work can depend on the contracts that end up getting presented to folks. The other thing that's going to take into account, and this is where most people really do need to pay attention, and I kind of start with it first, since that's what most people really care about when we look at these contracts, is you've got to take into account how much you're going to get paid. So all these payments are going to be based on a per metric ton of carbon sequestered. And currently, as we go through websites, these payments can vary from $10 to $20 per metric ton of CO2 equivalent that's being sequestered in the property. If we go back to my table at the start, a lot of this is below a lot of the break-even prices that producers may be looking at. And we're not even talking yet about what do we do if we've already established these practices and we've already been sequestering this carbon on the property. Now, looking at that, that doesn't mean you're going to get that full amount. In a lot of these contracts, you may see that amount. That's not going to be the full amount you're going to get paid. Depending on the approach you take, the aggregators or the data manager will potentially take fees off that. So they're going to be paid a percentage of that or a set fee based on that, depending on the language in the contract. The company is also going to withhold potentially a portion of the payment to cover the natural loss of carbon. So we're going to sequester carbon, but carbon's naturally going to escape depending on environmental effects, weather, other things that could go on could potentially cause carbon to leach out. So we'll look at what that natural loss is. So if we take, for example, 10% is withheld to cover fees and 20% is covered, withheld to cover the natural loss, and we have a $12 per metric ton of CO2 equivalent sequestered, we're not looking at $12 we're going to get paid. We're looking at much more, $8.40, if I did the math correctly when I put this example together. So our payments are going to go down. So when we look initially at what's going on in the contract, we have to pay attention to what is being taken out of that price to make sure it's still going to work. And depending on the practices being implemented or being utilized, this may not actually work in the long run. The other thing to pay attention to in a lot of these contracts, and I never thought I would have to give a presentation where I talked about, payment could be in the form of, cash, crypto, or credits for future purchases. Mainly the crypto part was not something I ever thought I'd have to give a presentation on, at least at this point. But a lot of these companies, a few of them really are looking at trying to get people to not take cash, but to take payments in some form of cryptocurrency, whether it be Bitcoin or another cryptocurrency that's on the market out there. That's something to pay attention to, and can also go back and impact, what the price is and how much you're getting paid, depending on what the conversion rate is with the cryptocurrency to the US dollar at that point. Credits for future purchases. In some cases, some of these companies looking at doing this are seed companies or other chemical companies looking to sequester carbon. So there could be credits with them for future purchases of other services down the road or other inputs that could go into the farm. So when we get to verification, this is the biggest issue that's going to apply in a lot of these contracts. This is a new and not really precise science. So we're going out and we're basically verifying how much carbon has actually been sequestered over the course of this contract or during the term of the contract or each year, depending on how it's written. And as I say, it's not precise, so you need to read into that. It's not always potentially going to be accurate, and that's one of the bigger challenges with a lot of these contracts is figuring out how do we precisely verify, what's actually going on the piece of ground, so we know actually how much carbon is being sequestered, how much is potentially being lost based on the practices, and how much you really should be getting paid. This can be a costly thing to do. If we go back to my example with the payment, you may be paying for a portion of this verification process out of that payment, depending on how that's split between the parties. And going back to contracts, this is really hard for right now, a lot of legal, University of Legal people to talk about right now, because we're not seeing the contracts. We're trying to, figure out exactly how do we go about building this into whatever we talk about is how much you could be losing out on what you're getting paid based off what the cost of this verification process could be. It could be costly to do. It can impact what you're paid in the end. The other thing to take into account is this verification going to take place based on science? Going back to what I said, we look at the practices, we go out, we do soil samples to figure out, what's the carbon being sequestered and other things going on. Are we just going out and looking at, okay, based on this soil type, that the farm has, based on these practices, and it's this many acres, and this happened over the course of the year. Well, based on that, if I plug everything into a computer, it looks like you should have sequestered this much. So it's much more just figuring out on paper how much was sequestered. So we have to take into account, is it much more, getting slightly closer to science and accurate as to what's going on. The other way is sort of based on science as well, but it's much more based on just plugging numbers in and, coming up with a number in the end. So we have to take that into account as well, as which one's going to be utilized and which one can benefit us more depending on the situation. The other thing is, what happens if there's a release of carbon? What happens if someone just screws up one day, not paying attention? Someone goes out on the wrong piece of property that has this contract on it and tills up the soil when it shouldn't be. What happens if there's a release of carbon in some way? Have we violated the terms of contract? What exactly happens? Do we have to pay money back to the companies in the end? How does that actually play out? Again, this is one of those areas where, because of the lack of contracts and the lack of transparency, sometimes it's really hard to figure out what's going on in some of these areas as to what would happen. But it's something to pay attention to, especially if there's potentially going to be a release in the end based on an accident. And then based on all of this with the verification process, as you go through it, do you have some sort of right to appeal the decision of the company? How do you go about doing that? If the company comes up with all these numbers, how do you go about, appealing it if you think they're off or you don't think they're right? And that's something that's still not entirely clear in a lot of these contracts. Like I said before, we have a lot of producers, specifically in this region, who may be doing things that have already, led to carbon being sequestered on their properties for years. So what if we've already been doing no-till, other carbon sequestering practices? How do we get paid for that? Or can we get paid for that? And it's a really tough question, because some companies may potentially pay. Some do go out and pay for 2 to 5 years worth of practices in the past. But if we got 20 years of it, doing this, is that enough? Do we want to just get paid for 5, or do we want to wait to see how we could potentially get verified and pay for more? Additionally, this is going to require more verification and more going in, more doing testing to figure out exactly how much is being sequestered already, and could the property sequester more carbon, or, you know, is it at a natural limit for sequestering carbon? As I mentioned earlier, there's data ownership issues with this. You're turning over data when you get into the market, because we're going to have to look at the practices being utilized. They're potentially going to be looking at certain farm records, certain production records, production histories, other information to sort of figure out what's going on that piece of property, and how much, you know, are you doing what you say you're doing, and can we use this as part of the way to verify? So we really do have to make sure that as we're turning this data over to the companies, you know, what will the third parties do with that data? What are the protections that exist out there for your data? And how do you get access back to that data if you walk away from that company? So how does a company turn that data over? This is a larger problem than just carbon contracts. It sort of exists out there with a lot of farm and other company issues with this personalized data for the business, and how do we manage that in a way? And there really aren't good answers on that yet, as much as we would want there to be. Currently, we're looking at these contracts. They're potentially 10 to 20 years in length. There are some that are shorter. Some could be up for a year, where you just get paid for 1 year and then you can go do something else. There's shorter term contracts potentially in the forestry industry, potentially depending on what's going to go on that piece of property in the future. But you've got to pay attention to the length, and how does that length impact the payout over the course? Are we looking at that payout being reduced because it's going over a longer course of years, or changing just based on that? So it's something we really are looking at as we move forward. The other thing we really have to pay attention with these is, you know, what can the penalties be if the land transfers and the new owner doesn't sequester the carbon that was agreed upon? Does the contract run with you, or does it run with the property itself? So the new owner is going to be held responsible for that. That's an area where there's still, again, not a lot of answers on how a lot of this is going to be handled. My view is a lot of these are going to end up being filed as some kind of easement with the property, so we know it runs with the land, and we have some sort of recourse for the company if the land transfers, and then we have some ability to make new owners aware of this property being under this contract. The same of all this would be true if it's leased property, and, you know, we're working with one tenant and then transfer the lease to a new tenant. The new tenant's going to have to be willing to take on a lot of these responsibilities, especially if you're the landlord and you're getting paid on any of this, or if you're the new tenant coming in and the landlord's expecting this. You're going to have to be able to work within the bounds of whatever this carbon sequestration contract states. Takeaways, and I think I left enough time, about 5 minutes, for questions if all this works out. This truly is a developing market. It's, you know, it's come up again probably in the late 2000s, right before about 2010. There was some push for this, and then it kind of died down. But it really is coming back, and it still is very much a developing market where there are not a lot of answers, specifically when it comes to some of these contracts. Yeah, at times there are a lot more questions than there are answers. I go to a lot of different meetings with extension economists, and this is one of the biggest topics we talk about, and are trying to figure out answers, because we're trying to figure out how to relate some of this to work with landowners and producers to better understand these agreements and be able to understand how to take advantage of them when they're presented to them. The best advice right now is read the contracts and work with attorneys to get good advice on these things. They may have not seen a carbon contract before, but they're very similar to other sort of contracts that they may have been associated with in the past, easements and other things, where they can kind of sit down and look at and kind of think about what some of the pros and cons that you should be aware of as you're looking at them. They're going to have potentially huge impacts on farms and limit potentially what could go on. So we really do need to have some good legal representation in all of this. The Growing Climate Change Solutions Act will provide sort of a valuable guidance in the marketplace. It will help provide some guide rules that we can at least work within and have better systems in place, specifically with that verification process, and better understand how it could be adopted and worked in to make it at least more reliable for producers. And if you want to hear someone better than me speak on this, you can go to go.umd.edu/carbon video. About a month and a half ago, we did a session with Shannon Farrell from Oklahoma State, who has been working on this and developing a guide for Oklahoma producers on this. And then Josh, and I can't remember Josh's last name, I think it's Maxwell, it's escaping me right now. He works for the House Ag Committee for the Republicans, and he's talking about some of what they would like to see within this growing Climate Change Solutions Act and how they want it to at least operate to work to allow for a voluntary marketplace to develop. And like Jared said, I do a blog. It's at agris.umd.edu. I've been working on a post related to carbon contracts all day, and we'll hopefully have it done in the next couple of weeks to post up there. And any questions, and I will stop sharing my screen once I get over to my contact info.
All right, thanks, Paul. Yeah, if you have any questions for Paul, you can put them in the Q&A, and pay attention to his website and follow his blog, because he'll be updating on any information. I know some people have received contracts, and there's some questions about that, and some of you haven't received it yet, but it's probably going to come down the pipeline. So I would definitely look to University of Maryland's legal blog